Plus, it's a bunch of young folks doing it. So I'm letting that go.
Shonda went down to grab it, so she'll bring it as soon as she
All right, cool. Eula Mitchell, Dennis Red, Nisha Riley, Marianne Khan.
I am not a big so I don't follow her.
Yeah.
Or I've like tweeted, I think now a total of 60 times.
Well,
30
I
of which
retweeted the
I
report.
saw.
Yeah.
I was so excited. Thank you for doing that.
Of course.
I like 30 of my lifetime tweets were that one. So like with my team, I have squat 12 times now. They're like, no,
They're like,
not
that's
have
not.
squat. But I'm like, tweet, squat. No.
Tweeted.
Experts, y'all ready? Y'all ready? Excuse me. Y'all ready?
Sorry.
That's fine, have fun. It's Danielle, she's the problem. Put her in detention. All right, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How y'all feeling?
Awesome.
I like your enthusiasm, whoever you are. My name is Marlon Peterson. Welcome to this amazing panel here. The title of this panel is How Do We Respond to Violence? Strategies for Transcending the Punishment Paradigm. So a couple of things, a couple of housekeeping, that's what they say, right? So please make sure your phones are off. Check now, just in case. Don't assume. Off or vibrate, please just make sure that happens. Also, please, once again, if there is an open seat next to you, please make that available for someone else that may be coming into the room. For our panelists, this is being live streamed, so y'all gonna be everywhere, so you can tell your mama and them that you're gonna be in a room where everybody's on. If you're taking pictures, I just like to say one thing that's very important. I just want to say, so panelists, you can take pictures of any of us, including me. For our panelists all the way to the end, please do not take any pictures of her. It's a personal request, so be conscious of that. Personal request, please. So the panelists on the end, I'm saying the panelists on the end, 'cause I want to give her a proper introduction. So the panelists on the end, please do not take any pictures of her. You can take of all these good-looking people. She's good-looking too, don't worry, but she has other things that's happening.
All of them beautiful folks. Thank you.
So how do we respond to violence? Strategies to transcend the punishment paradigm. Thank you, because you know I might get caught in mouth. So here's a couple of things here. So I'm also a writer, and one of the things I like to do is in that frame of thought, it's to sort of like break things down, break words down. Oftentimes we just sort of use words in routine without really sometimes getting a real context of where it comes from, what it means. So there's two words I sort of defined for us today, and it helps us in the context of what we'll be discussing. The two words are paradigm and transcend. So listen, it's off the internet, so you know, big time. Can't hear me? Okay. Can you hear me a little bit better now? Yeah. All right, I'm going to use my schoolyard voice, just in case. I know how to do that. That's right, Aisha. So the first word I want is transcend, right? So we have this in a sentence, and it's a verb, so it means it's an action verb, right? Action word. And it means to go beyond the range or limits of something, right? So just kind of like keeping that in our context. And the second word is paradigm. And the definition I have there is a framework containing the basic assumptions, ways of thinking, and methodology that are commonly accepted by members of a community. So as we think about this, we're having this conversation today, how do we respond to violence? Strategies to transcend the punishment paradigm. We'll have folks here on this panel who have been doing work in this arena for a very long time, who have a tremendous amount of expertise and coming from different perspectives and different angles and also taking varying approaches, right? So we have a little bit for everyone. And I also say this anytime I'm in these spaces, one, thank you for allowing us to be in your space, to listen to us. But I also say that the expertise often lies in the room, right? So we're here behind the table. There's a level of expertise and experience that we have, but there's in no way beyond or overbalancing beyond the expertise that's in this space. All right, so it's an interchange of ideas and expertise. So as I mentioned, my name is Marlon Peterson, founder of Presidential Group. I'm a Social Justice Fellow, among many other things. I'm thankful to be in this space. To my immediate left is a Eula Mitchell. Please give a Eula Mitchell a round of applause. She has a very interesting perspective on this. She's also a criminal justice expert. She has, degrees in criminal justice, but she also has a very personal connection to this conversation that she will share with us as well, along with her advocacy around these issues. So thank you for being with us, Ayula Mitchell. To her left is Danielle Sarid. I can't believe I said her name wrong. I've known her for a while now. She's director of the Common Justice program called Director of Common Justice, a program at the Vera Institute, and recently came out with a report that I'm sure she will refer to a little bit today. Did I say something incorrect? Oh, okay, all right. So please give Danielle a round of applause. To her right is the only guy. We had to have one guy just to, say we're here. So we have Vincent Shirali, who's currently now a senior research fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School for Program and Criminal Justice Policy and Management, and has been doing systems work in varying ways through the New York City Department of Probation, Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, so on and so forth for many years. So thank you, Vinny, for being with us today. And to his immediate left is Mariam Kaba, organizer, educator, curator. She was once with the NIA Institute. She's an educator around issues of criminal justice, particularly youth and juvenile justice. Originally from New York, was in Chi-Town for a bit, did a tremendous amount of work in Chi-Town. Now she's back on this side. So thanks for being back with us, Mariam. So I want to set up the context for this conversation here really quick, right? So I just spent 2 months out of the country. I was in Trinidad, where my family is from, which also has a huge issue with crime, particularly gun violence. There's 88 homicides in the country thus far of only 1.3 million, and it's one of the wealthiest countries in the Caribbean. And the reason why I'm bringing this context to it is this. When you listen to the media and law enforcement and politicians in that country, they're currently in a place of probably where we were, let's say in New York City, maybe 30, 40 years ago, when we were like, well, we need to put more people in jail. We need to lock folks away. We need to put them away as long as possible. In that context, the death penalty is still there, and it's hanging. It's not hanging is still the form where they're using the death penalty, and we need to hang folks, right? So I'm actually in many ways witnessing to production of possibly mass incarceration in the Caribbean island. So here we are now in this current time in 2017 here speaking about how can we respond to violence differently. What are some of those paradigms? What are all the paradigms that we have been connected to thus far, and how can we transcend them, right? So I just want to set up that context where in many cases, the policies and policies that we have here in America are exported to other countries. So we have opportunity here with experts to be able to not only speak about what's happening here in the American context, but also help inform what's happening beyond these borders, as I think Angela Davis sort of alluded to last night. So I want to sort of just kind of like go down the line and starting with you, Ms. Mitchell. So what brought you to this work? I gave a sort of introduction of like there's a personal connection, but I'd like you to give your own personal sort of open up like how you got into this work and also where you're from.
Hi, everybody. I'm just honored and excited to be here. People ask that question often, what brings me to this work, but a better question for me is what keeps me in this work. My background is I was raised in a law enforcement family. So my dad was a police officer. My uncle was a police officer who became chief of police. My stepmom was an investigator for the district attorney's office, and my stepfather was a parole officer. Wow. And so I was literally born into the criminal justice system, right? Except when I was 14 years old, I read a book called If They Come in the Morning. And Angela Davis' story really changed the trajectory of my life. And I decided that I wanted to be involved in the criminal justice system. So I went to college, got my degree, et cetera, et cetera. But while I was in college, I had an opportunity in 1984 to take a group of young people to San Quentin. And I was amazed then as a young college student with the number of Black and brown men that I saw behind those walls. And I knew then that I wanted this to be my career, that I wanted to work with those behind the walls. So needless to say, my family kind of gave me the side eye and said I went to the other side. And I continue. This is my 33rd year working in the criminal justice field in many, many different capacities. And my heart, my commitment has been to those who have been behind the wall, long before we got the verbiage of ending mass incarceration, I was saying it's too many people locked up. And since 1984, when I went to San Quentin for the first time, three major things have changed. And that is one, the number of California prisons. There are 33 prisons in California today. The length of time in which we are sending people to prison, and the age in which we are sending kids to adult prisons. In 1995, the age was lowered from 16 to 14, that kids in California could be tried as adults. And so every time something happens, I just go harder. And my personal part of the story is 8 years ago, my life was forever changed and impacted by people who cause harm. In 2009, my son, who is now 31, was 23 at the time. He survived 17 gunshot wounds. His friend was killed that night. He was shot with an AK-47, a 9mm, and a MAC-10. And I was in trial. I was working as an investigator, and I was in trial on a homicide at that time. So here I am working with the defense team of a young man of color, and my own son was fighting for his life. 15 months later, as our family was getting back to some sense of normalcy, my middle son, who was 19 years old, was murdered on Mother's Day of 2010. And for the first time, I kind of questioned, do I want to still do this work? Do I still want to work with those behind the walls? And, you know, it's always that one friend that just says something to you simple but profound. And she just looked at me and said, well, what else are you going to do? And that really resonated with me because I understand that it's not what I do, it's who I am, that this is a calling, that this is what I'm purposed to do. And so despite what I've been through on a personal level, despite the loss of one son and the tremendous amount of harm done to another son, and the impact that it's had on my family, I still believe in the redemption of people. I still believe in forgiveness. I believe in healing. One of the major things that happened for me from the onset, driving to the hospital the night my son was shot, was praying for my son and praying for those who had done harm, never wanting them to be imprisoned. The young man who murdered my 19-year-old son was murdered last year, and I felt a tremendous amount of sadness because, again, that was somebody's son, that was somebody's father, that was somebody's brother. And so I just believe in the power of forgiveness. I believe in healing. I believe that everybody who has caused harm has been harmed, and therefore they deserve to be healed as well.
Thank you. Thank you. That's to me, I just have an urge to say this is what love looks like.
That's right.
Danielle?
Thank you. I should have known not to sit next to you. I've known Ayula for a while now. My name is Danielle Sarrett. I'm from Chicago, though I've been in New York for the better part of 20 years now. And I direct Common Justice, which develops and advances solutions to violence that meets the needs of those who are harmed, advance racial equity, and don't rely on prison. At the core of our work is the first and only alternative to prison in the adult system for serious and violent crime. It operates out of Brooklyn, and as of the next couple of weeks, we'll be operating out of the Bronx. But I came of age in Chicago at that same moment you were referring to, Marlon, right, where there were high levels of violence. Like when we say the number of murders we're seeing in Chicago are the highest they've been for 25 years, right? Where the last time they were that high was when I was coming of age in that town, and we called it the crack epidemic. We talked about that as the thing that we were seeing unfold historically, but we were also seeing the beginning of mass incarceration. And so I saw folks I love go away, right? And saw families try and rearrange in the absence of the people who had anchored them, who had loved them, who had cared for them, who had sometimes infuriated them, but were now gone, and watched the difficulty of those people coming home. I believe that prison targets the thing in each of us that like makes me suffer when you feel pain. And some people have the strength of spirit that no amount of time in that environment is going to damage that human capacity. I'm humble enough to know that I might not be one of those were I to sustain that. So people came home and for the most were worse from it and hurt those of us close, all of us. Like we start in our families and work our way out. Like very few people hurt anyone who lives more than a mile from them. And so saw that pain unfold. And part of me thought, this is terrible for families. It's not making people better. But at least the people those people hurt must have some peace from it, right? The victims of the crimes, because that was the story we were being told. And so I started to think about my own experience as a victim of serious violence, the experiences of people around me, to listen to people. And it turned out that most of us didn't actually want the people who hurt us locked up. And even those of us who did, their incarceration never delivered us from our pain. It never delivered us our healing. It didn't deliver us from poverty and from inequity and from the kinds of things that made violence likely in the first place. Like it did not give us the thing we were promised. And at that same time, as I started to see it, I got in a lot of trouble. I was a young white kid. I was white then too. And I got, it's real. And I feel like these days you got to clarify.
Whiter every day, too.
I know, seriously. New York is hard. I work too much. And in my most serious case, which I won't talk about in a lot of detail, the system met me with mercy. And it met the young man who I got in trouble with, who was a young man of color, with nothing but rage. And so I came to understand the racial disparities in the criminal justice system as someone who benefited from them. And that meant two things to me. It meant, one, that I just had a lifetime obligation to go to war with those inequities and to find everyone I could find to join in that war. My elders, young people around me, everyone I could find who was in that battle. But it also meant, like, as a white person, I knew something, which was that when the system wants to act mercifully, when it wants to act humanely, it can do so. It does so all the time. It's why Glenn earlier says I talk about whiteness as the oldest alternative to incarceration in America. We know how to divert people. And so for all the legislative change that needs to happen and all of the other reforms that need to happen, the truth is the system has the tools to do something other than draconian punishment. And those of us who are white can testify to that because we have been diverted in every way all the time. From when we hear the word detention, we think it means staying late after school, not a juvenile jail, right? Like we have been diverted. And so one of the things we can do is call, are we allowed to swear on live stream? Call BS on the story that we don't know what else to do because we are living testaments to the fact that we do full well know what else to do when we hold someone's humanity central. And so I am in the business, and then we at Common Justice are in the business of making the kind of possibilities that we know exist available equally in a way they never have been in this country.
Vinny?
So thank you for putting me on this powerful woman panel here. I appreciate it, and really honored to your stories, both of the ones I've heard so far. I grew up in Brooklyn. I've spent the first 20.
It's good. It's not do that. I'm sorry. It comes out. I can't.
First 20 years of my career in nonprofits at the Center for Community Alternatives here, the Center for Juvenile and Criminal Justice in San Francisco, and the Justice Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., as an advocate, service provider, and researcher. And then in 2005, my career took a turn that I didn't expect. The mayor of Washington, D.C., after I was a really vicious critic of the juvenile system there, asked me to run the system. And so I ran Washington, D.C.'s juvenile justice system. And when I took over, the system had been under a lawsuit for a consent decree and a lawsuit for 19 years. And I was the 20th director of the department during that 20-year period, or that 19-year period. So we had a little more than one a year. The lawyers in the case made a motion to put the department into receivership, which was pending when I took over. And Covington and Burling, which is a big law firm that Eric Holder works out, had just become the lead lawyer in that case, not him, but his firm. And they did an investigation, and and they found that staff were routinely, and I'm going to talk about institutionalization as a form of violence against young people. That's what I'm going to say. I'm going to show a clip, and you can go ahead and just start it if you want. It's a little nasty, folks. So if this is your trigger warning. If it's something you don't want to see, check email now, right? Or look at something. But I don't want to talk about young people being violated in prisons without showing a little of that. So when I took over, and you just keep showing it until you feel like stopping, all right? Well,
All the colors
sorry
of
about
the
and so staff were routinely beating the kids up.
Newfoundland and Labrador.
A facility made up of literally a bunch of NCAA Division I football players who, when something would happen, the kids would mouth off, or they would take a swing at one of the other staff. They would beat them up, strip them naked, and throw them into the isolation cell. The isolation unit was always full, and it was supposed to be 23 hours a day, but very often they never let those kids out. And then the kids in the other units didn't get out all that much either, by the way. Staff were routinely sexually assaulting the kids. Staff were routinely sexually assaulting one another. New female staff that came on to work in the facility quickly learned that if they didn't put out for their supervisors, they might find themselves in compromising positions with the boys, and no one would come to help them. The rich trade in drugs. Staff were selling drugs to the kids. Eventually, because we got to know the kids real well, they told us who it was. They wouldn't testify against them because there's a taboo against snitching. But we knew who it was. We ultimately were able to figure out a way to get rid of those people. They would routinely handcuff the kids. We often would see the kids walking around the facility in shackles. And the physical plant was such a depressing, deplorable place. Cockroaches and rats used to crawl up on the kids and bite them at night, and they would show us where it was. Kids used to take their shirts off and stuff them around their toilet bowls, keep that from happening. This was the juvenile justice system in the District of Columbia, right? It wasn't like some podunk place, right? It was our nation's capital's juvenile justice system. I ran it for 5 years. I never had one white kid committed to my custody in the 5 years I ran the place. Now, D.C. is disproportionately African-American town, but it ain't that disproportionately African-American. And I think Danielle's right. It always struck me that we don't have to invent a new model. We already got a model. It's the model that kicks into gear when a white kid gets in trouble, right? All sorts of resources come to bear. We divert them. We do the sensible thing. It's not like we should object that white kids get that system. It's just we should say all kids should be getting that system. So what you saw here is
They just saw Khalif.
What's that?
They just finished watching Khalif.
They just finished watching. So the first one's from Australia. This is ubiquitous. It's not idiosyncratic. I don't want you to think that D.C. was an outlier. I think D.C. was rather typical. I think there are some places that are worse and some places that are better. The Associated Press did an analysis they contacted every juvenile institution in the country in 2008, and they found that there were 16,000 complaints of abuse in facilities containing 46,000 kids, and it has always been my position that the kids underreport. Their lives are so enmeshed in violence, and the violence in the institutions are so routinized that they don't even think of it as violence at a certain point. So that there were 16,000 reports of violence is unbelievable. And the Justice Department did an analysis in 2012, a very sophisticated survey of young people in institutions, and found that 1 of 8 of them were sexually assaulted. So I have a lot of discussion I could say about alternatives and ways we should move away from this system. There are several states now that no longer have youth prisons. They just don't have them anymore. New York City is actually, for people going through juvenile court, there's no youth institutions anymore. They used to send them upstate. Now we brought them all home, and they're in homes that are between 6 and 20 beds. Some of them don't have locks on the door. Some of them do, but nothing like a big prison. They used to all be upstate in like the Finger Lakes and the Adirondacks, where their parents could never go visit them. Now they're all within the 5 boroughs. They're small. They're run by nonprofits. You should kick the tires on them, because I don't want to say, anytime you deprive somebody of their liberty, you need to watch it, because there's an inevitable drift towards oppression and bureaucratization. It's just hard to deprive people of their liberty without falling into the trap of having too much power over another human being. That having been said, I think that the close-to-home facilities in New York City are pretty good, and that they are as non-institutional as you'll probably find anywhere. Doesn't excuse what we do at Rikers, which is what you're seeing here with Khalif. The longer clip was Khalif Browder. So I'll talk more about what I think we could do about this in the question and answer period, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Vinny. Mariam Kaba.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. So yeah, I'm Miriam Kaba. I founded and run an organization called Project NIA. Our work is to end youth incarceration. So we're an abolitionist organization. As Marlon said, I grew up here in New York City. I left in 1995 to move to Chicago. And I just came back last summer, back home to New York. So I spent over 20 years in Chicago, a city that is a lot in the news, as you all know, because the current occupant of the White House loves to use Chicago basically as a metaphor to reinforce white supremacy and justify continued violence against particularly people of color. But Chicago is a city that's as complicated and beautiful as any other. And I had the occasion while I was in Chicago to work with a lot of young people in conflict with the law, as well as do a lot of work around anti-criminalization, using a restorative and transformative justice lens. That's the focus of our work at Project NIA. I want to say a couple of things about kind of how I came to do the work that I do. One of the things is that I myself am a survivor of violence, who really found that pretty quickly I didn't have, the system wasn't going to basically provide what it needed to provide to me at the time as a teenager. I figured out pretty quickly that I had to figure out how to take care of myself, and also make sure that I had a community of support. So I had an idea as I was growing up that this system was not broken, but actually designed to oppress and manage people's, pain and suffering into the service of something that I didn't understand at the time, but now do. The second thing was that I had a student who killed another one of my students. I just want to remind people that not to take photos of me or take any video. Those people are coming in and doing that, so please don't. The second thing was a student of mine killed another one of my students, and that was through that process I kind of became much more, I think I started to understand the concepts of restorative and transformative justice through that, and that was in the early 90s. And since then, it's been my mission and my passion and my avocation to try to figure out how you deal with harm without relying on the system. And so I've built organizations that focus on doing transformative and restorative justice kinds of processes when people suffer from harm. And the last thing I want to say is that I came pretty early to understanding that we were having a problem in conversation and definition as it relates to these issues. That to conflate incarceration and crime is a problem. To conflate incarceration and violence is a problem. These things have relationships to each other, but not in the ways that we often think, right? Incarcerating people doesn't actually reduce crime. That's a fact that's actually empirically proven by the trillions of studies that have been done on these issues, right? That the National Academy of Science report that came out a couple of years ago that showed this kind of almost negligible impact of incarcerating this many people on actual crime rates. And we found out pretty quickly that other countries were also experiencing spikes during the mid-60s to the mid-70s in terms of homicides and robberies. It wasn't just the US, right? Europe was experiencing its own spike, and so was Canada. The difference between Europe and Canada and the US is our response. Yeah. That we decided to build a system that would mass incarcerate and in some ways re-enslave a huge number of people. And other countries chose to go a different route. So we actually know what to do, I think. And particularly, I think the last thing I want to say is I don't like conversations of discussions about the politics of violence and safety married to the conversation about incarceration, because we actually know what to do to decrease the numbers of people in prison. Like, we could do that tomorrow and get a lot of people home and free. And those will not make a material impact on the violence that's experienced in certain communities or the quote crime that we say we're fighting. So I think I want to talk more about that, because I think we actually know what to do if we want to end incarcerating people. We stop incarcerating people. We do know what to do. It's the other stuff, the politics of it, the language of it, our own fear, and our need to make people other, and our need for revenge and punishment that needs to be addressed. And I think that's harder to do. So thank you.
Thank you, Marion. So as it stands, so I'm going to come back to that point which you mentioned, just about you don't like Marion, those two things about those responses, incarceration. In Chicago right now, as of today, 105 homicides, right? And that's, as you saw, our person sitting in the White House brings that up every time. That's his catch point: Chicago, Chicago, Chicago. So here's my question: why, for those who are not aware, how do we make that divorce? Like, why should we make that divorce between saying that the responses to violence and incarceration? Why should we have a divorce there, as you're saying that it shouldn't be married?
Right. Yeah. I think the divorce is already there, which is that if your interest is in decreasing homicides, prisons don't work. Mm-hmm. Like, if that's really what you're trying to do, prisons simply don't work. What we do know is that giving people jobs works as a deterrent to homicide. But yet that's not what's being offered in a Marshall Plan. You're not hearing the person in the White House, as I don't call him by, the person in the White House right now. He happens to be there for now. I think that if he really wanted to offer something, then he would go into the communities where in Chicago, 60 to 75% of young men between the ages of 15 to 25 aren't in school or having jobs. They would go with that first, figure out what then the homicide rates look like after that, and then bring in more interventions. So the issue is not like people actually don't care. This is my contention. I don't think people care about the young people getting killed or the adults getting killed. I think those folks are tropes. Those people are symbols for people to be able to make a political argument for something else. Because if they did care, they would do something drastically different, which we know actually works. So the importance of divorcing those things is that those things are separate. They have some places where they connect, but they're mostly separate. The other reason to do that is because we know how to decrease the numbers of people in prison. We have you cut people's sentences, you release them, you make sure that folks aren't being diverted in the first place. We know how to do that. That's where policy can make a difference. I have less of a belief that we can make a difference materially in ending violence through policy. And that is something people don't want to actually listen to. We can probably end violence more towards, using organizing. And that's something different than policy.
We're going to get to that part about policy in the latter half, but I want to sort of come to you, Ayula, and now come to you, Danielle. So how does that sound as someone who has been a survivor of tragedy, right? Myself, I've just lost two good friends and one family member when I went to Trinidad in the last 6 months, right? How do you receive that? How did you initially receive the fact that maybe we need to divorce those responses to violence by incarceration? Was that something for you to easily accept? All right, okay. Was that something for you to easily accept, or was it difficult? And how do we get more folks who've been directly impacted by violence to sort of see the need to make that divorce?
I think Danielle touched on it when she mentioned people who have been harmed oftentimes are led to believe by law enforcement, by district attorney's offices, that your healing, your closure is going to come with the arrest, conviction, and incarceration of the person who caused harm to you, where that's just not true. So much of it has to do with healing of me as a crime survivor, of my son as a crime survivor, of all the siblings that are involved, of our family, of our community. We have to heal. And conversely, those that have caused harm have to have an opportunity to heal as well. And those opportunities are not present in prison. And so we end up sending people to prison who are already harmed, who then become further harmed, and then we don't prepare them if they do get released to come home, and it just becomes this crazy vicious cycle that absolutely can stop if there wasn't so much money involved in incarcerating people.
I think, yeah, and thank you for sharing. I think your perspective is particularly important in this conversation because this oftentimes what would happen in any political theater, they will bring somebody up who has been a survivor of violence and say, well, we need to do this because you see what happened to her or you see what happened to him. This is why we need to bring, in the case of current administration, we need to bring maybe the federal government into Chicago. So the reason why I'm sort of honed in on you particularly for that is that when we have these, when we hear the political rhetoric, we want us to be able to know how to respond to those things, right? So Danielle, you came out with a report, or the Common Justice came out with a report recently. It is titled "Accounting for Violence: How to Increase Safety and Break Our Failed Reliance on Mass Incarceration." And I know in that report you can expound upon it a little bit, but there are 4 particular points that you said that any response to violence should include, and the 4 points were that it should be survivor-centered, based on accountability, safety-driven, and racially equitable. So I'd like to expound on that, please.
Thank you. And I'll start by talking about when we say survivor-centered, a lot of us who are in the criminal justice reform field get really nervous because we've been told the story that victims of crime all want prison. And somehow even those of us who are victims of crime continue to believe that story. We're like, victims all want prison. And then we ask ourselves, do we want it? We're like, well, not me, but. And so in common justice, people have committed crimes like stabbings, gunpoint robberies, really serious harm, like things that no one should have to sustain, only get into common justice if the victims of their crime agree. Right? So the people who are hurt have to say, yes, I'm up for this person coming into this transformative process instead of going to prison. And it's important to remember that fewer than half of victims of violence call the police in the first place. So if we were truly survivor-centered, we would immediately, we're starting at 50%. That's an F. Right? If we were survivor-centered, we would regard that as the basis for an extraordinary moral crisis, and we would rise to it and we would address it, and we would address the kind of pain that Miriam is talking about, right? We would say that half that doesn't even make it into the system, that pain matters and is real, right? And so fewer than half call. Another half of those drop out before grand jury. So even though they picked up the phone to call the police in the moment of crisis or pain, once they're in the system, whether it is for fear or exhaustion or whatever else, they divest from that system before it makes it to grand jury. We're calling that little fraction of people who are still there, right? Arguably the jailingest subset of victims you will find, victims of serious violent felonies. And we are saying to those people, would you rather have the person who hurt you locked up or in common justice? Guess what % of those people choose common justice? 90%. 90. Find me that consensus on anything in this country, right? 90%. And it is not because crime survivors are all more merciful than we thought, or more forgiving than we thought, or more compassionate than they thought. It is because we are more practical than people think. Crime survivors are the most pragmatic group of people I have the honor of being a part of. Right? Because the truth is, if I live in some gated community somewhere and the thing I have to worry about is my poll numbers, then I can be interested in punishment and punishment's sake. And I can double down on interventions that actually decrease safety but increase my popularity. If my life depends on whether or not the response to the violence I sustained will get me killed or keep me safe, I have to choose the thing that will keep me safe. And prison isn't it. And if there is anything we have learned since when I was coming up in Chicago, it is that lesson. That I understand, I shared this in Chicago last week. I came home to a decapitated head on my front lawn one day. I am not mad at anyone who lived in my building, who wanted to call the cops, who wanted people locked up. We wanted something that would deliver us from the pain and danger we were facing. Some of us even then knew prison wouldn't be the thing. And almost all of us now know, because we have seen people go away and come back, and we are not safer for it. That's partly because crime is not driven by dangerous people. It is driven by structural factors like poverty and inequity and economic inequity, right? It's all those things that drive it, and prison is not targeting any of those things for sure. So one is that it is not the solution to the core drivers, but even on an individual level, so not talking about the structural factors, but even in those same conditions, what makes one person hurt someone when someone else doesn't? Because in fact, the vast majority of people living in poor communities of color in this country don't hurt anyone ever. Like the vast majority, right? And so even with the levels of violence we see, right? And so what drives violence on an individual level? Shame, isolation, and exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs, right? Like if we look to all the literature, shame, isolation, exposure to violence, inability to meet one's economic needs. If I had to define the 4 key features of prison, it would be shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs, which means our core response to violence has as its basis the core drivers of violence. It's like trying to put out a house fire by throwing a Molotov cocktail through the front door and acting surprised when the flames roll higher. Like we are dishonest. And so when survivors say no to prison, it is not because we are merciful. It is because we want to survive. And so I would say for the people who harm me, it's like my top choice is that they transform. So they do not hurt me or anyone else ever again. But like number 2, right below it, is that they suffer to the end of time. Right? It's not. I wish. In some cases, I have achieved a level of forgiveness I'm proud of. In others, I got a way to go. So it is not about my mercy. Like it is about my pragmatism. And part of what Common Justice believes is that a commitment to survivors means a commitment to responses to violence that produce safety. That shouldn't sound radical, but it actually requires an inversion of basically everything we do, from arrest to prosecution to incarceration to reentry.
Wow, thank you, Danielle. So I was on a train the other day, and you're looking at the billboards, and it had one up there. It's a young person, a toddler maybe, or a little bit older, and it says, "But what if I did something wrong?" And next to it, it says, "Please call for no one deserves neglect, abuse, etc." And I said, "Well, wow, how could that sort of be invoked into this conversation from a system's perspective?" Now, you're brought in like institutional violence, right? Vinny, particularly within our juvenile justice system. I'd like you to speak a little bit, like what do you think the impacts are, the levels of violence that you have experienced in these facilities? What is the impact, not only the people there, but on the communities that they return to?
Right. So I also want to add the staff to that, because the whole place was corrupted by violence, in my opinion. It was like, so I came out of my advocacy world fired up. When I got in there, I thought I was going to hate the staff and that they were going to ooze evil, because who could be in a place like this where people are beating the kids up and having sex with them and selling them drugs and just not be the embodiment of evil, right? And of course, there's a range of people inside, some of whom were doing this, and they learned pretty fast. I mean, I don't know if any of you read the Justice Department report on Rikers when it first came out a few years ago. But if you haven't, go back on. It's on a New York Times website. It's on a Justice Department website. And there's this section about the teachers and about how they sort of school the teachers in walking out of the room when they're going to beat up the people in the facility so that they can have like plausible deniability. And there's this whole complicated bunch of cognitive dissonance going on where people still wanted to believe they were good people while they were participating in this horribly corrupt and violent environment. So it wasn't just about, and then all of them went home and they went out into the world with their own little violence issues. So that was my experience with the staff. With the young people, and I got to know that there's only 1,000 kids in this system in DC, and we got it down to the point where we only had 60 of them in one. We closed that old facility down, built a new one, and it was smaller and much nicer. It was kind of like a college campus more than an institution. It's still locked custody, so trust me, there was still stuff going on, but it was better. But because the numbers were so small, I got to know the kids, and I knew their families, and the families came up. We brought the kids out to perform plays. We started to open ourselves up to stuff that was in the community, whereas before they were always just there. So like we performed theater, we played football against the other high schools, we played basketball against the other high schools. We took the kids out of locked custody so that they could be in the neighborhoods and do stuff. And it was super complicated. Like this one grandmother, I remember, like the kid that played Macbeth in our performance of Macbeth.
Macbeth in the juvenile prison.
And no, the Macbeth out at the Folger Shakespeare Theater. That's when we won. We were the best. We were the best, man. We were the best. We won that competition with a bunch of white schools that were suburban white schools and DC private schools. We won. And so this guy plays Macbeth, and his grandmother, when his time was getting ready to be up, called us up and said, don't let him come home, man, because he's these guys that are pulling up next to the house, kind of, looking in the window, waiting for him to be home because they're going to shoot him as soon as he comes home. And that was like really complicated. Like we had to find a place for him to live in Baltimore because we didn't want to send him home. And thankfully he had an aunt in Baltimore, and she was cool with it. And then this other young man, I remember, he had this sweet shot. He was the two guard on our basketball team, and he used to torch the other teams, but he never smiled, not once, man. He had this like serious look on his face all the time. And he invited me back to his room, and we had painted one wall in every room with this chalkboard paint, and gave him, because it was graffiti problems, the kids would carve stuff in the walls. It was like, that's your wall, man. Do whatever you want with that wall. And we gave him chalk, right? So he brings me back into his room, and his whole wall is full of tombstones, just like that, R.I.P., and a name and a date. And mom was up there, and dad was up there, and he didn't come in with a book. He didn't come in with a date book. He had all of them deaths memorized, his little friends, his relatives, and he never told anybody about that. That was his way of telling us about the pain he was in, which is why no matter how good a game he played, he was never going to smile, right? There was too much going on for that to happen. And so, the normal institutionalization process just re-traumatizes all of that. And as we want people to work stuff out, right? What do we want young people to do? We want them to develop a sense of agency, a sense of themselves as actors in the community in a way that we want them to be. We want to model that behavior for them, and we also want them to model that behavior for each other. We want them to be positive to each other and with each other. And institutionalization and imprisonment strips everybody of all of that. Even at its best, mostly it strips people of that. And then often it adds its own layer of violence on top of that. And so that's why we get what you were talking about is this terrible outcomes from this. If you were sitting around designing something to make a non-violent kid violent, you couldn't hardly do better than most prisons do. And these guys already come in with a whole bunch of trauma. So that's my answer to your question.
Thank you. Well, the reason why I posed that, because in the earlier panel, this young woman here pointing at you, this young woman, and it's a question that she asked in response to, she asked a question, but it's really a statement in saying that, many of the school systems feel like prisons in themselves, right? And I think it was a powerful sort of insertion there, because one of the responses was like, well, the way we respond it's a necessity to respond to the levels of violence in some of our schools to have police and law enforcement in there. And I'm curious to hear what the panel feels about that.
Yeah, I would say, violence does beget violence. And so the kind of institutional players and the gatekeepers of violence what is the role of a cop? I think in some ways we really do a disservice to police.
That's a question we rarely ask.
Right, like what are they supposed to be doing? What is their actual job description? Most people who go into policing think they're going in to solve murders and rapes. That's like what they think they're going to do. Instead, they're being told to be school counselors and disciplinarians and truant officers. This makes zero sense at all. One of the things we did at Project NIA for several years was run a peace room at our local school, which was a middle school in a community, which you would imagine. Lots of poor young people, overwhelmingly Black, highly punitive school, kids dropping out from the 7th grade, all sorts of trauma within the building, teachers traumatized as well. Lots of new young white teachers teaching young Black kids they didn't have any cultural understanding of. Just what you would imagine was going on, right, in that school. And we went in there like a bunch of jackasses initially, thinking we're going to come in and we're going to do this peace room and everything's going to be great. And y'all are going to love us. And we're here to provide a new culture to this whole entire school that's been 50 years in the making of punishment and disciplining and lack of love for these young people in that space. Anyway, we went in, our first year was disastrous for lots and lots of reasons. By the time we were there, in our second year at that school, we could see the beginnings of a change, both in the students who all of a sudden had a place to go when they wanted to just, things were just bad. They came into school that morning, stuff had gone on at home, they were on edge, they couldn't concentrate, they were acting out in class, and now they had a space to come where there were people there just to listen to them or just to leave them alone and do nothing, right? And all of a sudden, discipline issues in that school started to go down. We got to know the people who were the euphemistic school resource officers, really just cops in the building, so that when things would go down, people would say, go call Miss Clay, who was my staff person who was there along with all these community volunteers who were in this space. And said, go call her so she can come down. She would come down and talk to Officer Hernandez and say, I got him. Don't take him down. Don't book him. Don't put a record on him. By the time we left that school, there were a significant decrease in suspensions, expulsions, and arrests within the building. We did that with our own resources, not resources from the school district, which again tells you everything you need to know about what the priorities are within the system. Because it shouldn't be up to a community-based group with a tiny budget to come into a school and offer that kind of service and support to the particular people who were there. I mean, we had teachers who were so overwhelmed, so young. I was a terrible teacher when I started. You know, most of us are. Okay, that's a fact. You learn on the job. So, like, you know, like these young people coming right in idealistically, overwhelmed by these young people with lots and lots and lots of issues, they would come and drop their whole classroom off in the peace room and go and take a break. And, you know, I wasn't hating on them for that. It was better than being up front in the room yelling their heads off at students and having the kids be traumatized by that yelling on a regular. They just, you know, take my kindergarten. I can't deal with them. I need an hour. You know, we ended up having things like wellness days where we brought in people who were healers to do massages for the teachers and staff, right? People were in trauma, dealing with trauma, hearing about trauma, not knowing anything about how to deal with trauma. So I think that, you know, schools, and I want to say this as somebody who's taught in schools, we ask schools to do too much, okay? Schools are not set up to handle every problem, social problem in the universe. Parents who have substance abuse problems, who don't have jobs, who are suffering from other, we are not supposed to be able to handle all that. There's a great article by James Traub in the New York Times that was written years ago when I teach college students, and I tell my students to read this all the time. It's an article called What Schools Can't Do. And everybody should read it because there's a lot that schools can't do. And frankly, schools are not going to end poverty. That is a lie. Every person who keeps talking about education is the key to the universe of life. Education is good. Schooling is good. You can do education, though, without being in a school, right? So that's important. But education by itself is not going to end poverty, y'all. Mm-hmm. What we have is if you're born to poor parents, you're more likely to be poor no matter what the hell your education is like. That is a caste system, and that's about capitalism. And if you don't end capitalism, we ain't ending poverty. I'm sorry.
She going there. So anybody want to add anything to it? So I kind of want to like go into this sort of, I know y'all want to, calm down. Now. Y'all coming in just now. Y'all coming in a minute. So you know, as we're talking about, we're identifying a lot of where things are incorrect, where they're wrong, even some intentionalities behind why things are perpetuating themselves in this wrong way. So if you can like think about what are some of the like policies that needs to be shifted, changed, uprooted, upended, or implemented that can sort of create this paradigm shift that can transcend how we respond to violence in a way that that really impacts the whole person and the whole community. So just for anyone on the panel, a couple of y'all can answer it.
So I'd like to talk a little about, like, I think we should stop having these juvenile prisons for young people, and we should move the young people mostly out into the community back home with services, supports, and opportunities. And we should pay for those from the savings from the anywhere between $150,000 and $250,000 we spend right now to lock them up. And when you do that, there's no research there's no research that has found any institutional program that's superior to community-based programs. So when you do things in the community, you're practicing the behaviors you want the young people to engage in. So we really can shift that money from locked institutions and locked youth prisons back home. And that shift has begun. There's been a 51% decline in the number of kids locked up in facilities between 2001 and 2013, and the 2015 numbers are going to come out soon, and I think it's going to be close to 2/3 decline. So somebody said yesterday, though, by the way, that half is not enough, because even at half, we still have too many people locked up. The United States at half is still the largest incarcerator of our children per capita of anybody, and as the numbers have gone down, racial disparities have gone up. So that's not all we need to do. We need to pay attention to the issue that has been discussed on this panel and in other panels, that we're still discriminating against young people of color. But I think if we can shift those funds, especially if we shift them truly into the hands of community, as opposed to just taking them from one part of the government and putting them in another part of the government, I think that's a model. It's working in some places, and it really can work. And that's the kind of watershed change we should demand, not this incremental, let's just fix the institutions and paint them and change the outfits the kids are wearing and put this really super duper evidence-based practice in them. No, that dog won't hunt. It's been around for 170 years, these institutions. They stunk from the beginning, and they still stink.
So one of the areas that I would like to see policy change, and we've seen a little bit of it in California, has to do with when people are harmed and how the system responds to the person who's harmed. When my son was shot, how we were treated by everyone, from the security at the hospital to the medical personnel to law enforcement, was horrific. And that has to change, because it further traumatizes everybody. It's not helpful. The fact that in California, as in most places, the Victims of Violent Crime Office is attached to the district attorney's office is not helpful. In so many cases, not with my son in particular, but with the young men who I work with every day in the San Francisco County jails, so many of them have had contact with the district attorney's office, so that when they are harmed, you want them to go to the same office that is prosecuting them for something else to get help. And that's not going to happen. When my son was shot, because I understood how the system worked, because of my experience working in the system, I immediately got him an attorney to be present when they questioned him about the shooting. The attorney advocating for my son asked Oakland PD for a list of the questions that they were going to ask him and a guarantee in writing that he would not be arrested, because men of color somehow are always complicit when they are harmed. Oakland PD refused to adhere to what we were requesting, and therefore told the Victims of Violent Crime Office that my son was not cooperative and he received zero services. That's an area that has to absolutely change.
And I would build on that and say, like, the one entity in the criminal justice system that could end mass incarceration tomorrow are prosecutors, right? Like, the police arrest people and pass them on to prosecutors, and prisons receive people. So while they can make some decisions about parole on the way out, those decisions are constrained. Prosecutors exercise extraordinary discretion. So they can pick what charge they pursue, and that determines the sentence they're pursuing, right? Like, if they pursue a charge that comes with 1 to 3, that's the sentence they're talking about. And if they pursue a charge that comes with 15 to life, that's the sentence we're looking at. And so until these last couple years, I think as criminal justice reform folks, it's like we didn't remember prosecutors are elected. Like, we're like fired up about the mayor, right? And we're like fired up, like, sometimes about the school board. And like, in the prosecutor race, we're like, name the elected DA in your jurisdiction. People are like, right? And they have extraordinary power. Only 2% of convictions are arrived at by trial. The rest are all plea bargain, right? They're bargained out. So they are a negotiation led by prosecutors' offices. And so we have seen in these last couple years the emergence of prosecutors who have run on progressive platforms and won. So Ken Thompson in Brooklyn was one of those prosecutors who passed away last summer, though Eric Gonzalez, the acting DA, is carrying that legacy with a clarity and ferocity that should excite us all. Kim Fox in Chicago grew up in Cabrini Green, lost people to violence, lost people to prison, the first Black woman DA in Chicago, and is leading that city in bringing about an end to mass incarceration from the position of being the chief prosecutor there. You see Aramis Ayala in Orlando. You see Kim Ogg in Houston. So across the country, there is an emergence of a new kind of prosecutor. And I'm hopeful about them for two reasons. One is because they've made a different kind of commitment, right? They conceive of their responsibility differently. Like their job is to deliver safety, not to deliver convictions. And that means that they're going to be measured differently and they're willing to be measured differently. But I'm also hopeful because they are elected by different people. And the thing that drives what an elected official does is whether or not they will get reelected, if they do or don't do it. And so many of these folks are elected because of really powerful organizing, so that the people who put them in office are so often the people whose lives are on the line in the decisions they make. That means crime survivors, people who have been maybe incarcerated, and their loved ones. And so those are now the same people who can take those people out of office. So there's a mechanism for accountability to the most directly impacted communities from the prosecutor's office that didn't exist until we did the kind of organizing that elected those people in those positions. So I think there's enormous promise as that trend continues. I think there were 10 solid elections, like progressive victories on the same day that the man, what's his name, took the presidency.
The man that should be named. Anything you want to add, Mariam, in terms of policies that should be shifted?
No, I mean, I just think I think I alluded to earlier that I'm suspicious of policy for lots of reasons. I'm suspicious of policy because usually it's an elite consensus. The people who are directly impacted have almost no role in creating those policies. And because of that, we end up with situations where people are being traded off against each other in policy. So part of why we have this bifurcation of the violent, nonviolent is because elite consensus says, let's focus on the nonviolent drug offenders and let's double up on the punishments and sentencing.
Well, it's also happening in the current context of immigration, where there's those who have not been convicted of crime, and those who have. So
exactly. So, like, I am suspicious of those. It doesn't mean that I don't engage in policy making or engage in pushing for certain policies that I think could be non-reformist reforms. It's not that. But I think we have to really focus on organizing in our communities. I think we're going to have to do door-to-door stuff. I think we have to, especially because right now the federal government is foreclosed to most of us. I don't think you're going to have these big nonprofit industrial complex groups going over to meet with the person in the White House's administration. I don't think you're going to have those little closed door meetings. I think that's foreclosed to a lot of people, which is going to force a lot of people to get hyper local. And I think that actually might get us further than we've gotten, because now new voices, different people will be at the table around shifting the narrative, which I think so critical in this moment. The thing that, the federal government can't do a lot around criminal punishment issues, but it can do some stuff around rhetoric and incentives. And rhetoric is so important right now. You see what's happening with painting Chicago as like the jungle, right? And that will bring more violence to the people in the city. The people in the city have to be like strong together to build enough power to push back against that narrative about the city. That's going to take on the ground, local one-on-one organizing, the kinds of things that, Common Justice is doing in a hyper-local way in particular communities, what Project Neon, my organization, did for years. It's going to take that to shift these big wins that we're going to be kind of facing over the next at least 4 years. So I think we need to think more about organizing while we also do engage in some useful policy making. But I'm against and I hate the way that things have been going in, quote, criminal punishment reform over the last 5 years. It's been a smoke and mirrors. I've said it. I keep saying it. I don't give a fuck where I'm invited or not invited.
We can't
as a
curse
result
it. Just
of
throwing it out.
I don't want to do it. Oh, you can X-nay that out. Sorry. But I feel like it's really annoying. I've been watching this. It's like, well, how many percentage, we've like 5% decrease in the last 10 years of people incarcerated after all this activity that was all just like, bipartisan consensus, this and this and this. And meanwhile, we've made it harder for certain people to get out. We have a whole bunch of folks now with life without parole increases by 20% over the same period. So now we have people in jail forever as a trade-off for getting a few people off who, did drug crimes off. No, we do not leave people behind. We refuse that kind of crap, and we don't trade lives for another in policy making. I think that's disgusting.
Vinny, I know you want to, 1 second, Vinny, before you say your comment. So I just want to engage the audience now. So if you have any questions, comments, you can start. I guess, I don't know if there's going to be people walking around with the microphone. I don't know how this working here, but I want to now have the conversation between the panelists and the audience. So I guess walk up to the microphone. I don't know how that's working, but that's where we're at now. Vinny?
Yep. So I just want to sort of amplify what you just talked about. There's this whole set of beliefs that we can sort of incrementally technical assistance our way out of mass incarceration.
There's money in technical assistance.
Look, technical assistance can be good, but it's just not the answer. It's organizing. And if you look, there are several areas in America where we have actually substantially reduced incarceration. The juvenile system is one. It's a 51% decline. That's not trivial. And I think part of that is because of advocacy. People never quite gave up on juveniles the way they did on adults.
Yes.
And they kept fighting the fight. And there's a lot of women-led movements. Like there's this group called Youth First, run by a woman named Liz Ryan right now. Go online and look at Youth First, okay? And they are fighting to close juvenile institutions around the whole country. I think every employee of that place is women, and most of the people in the states that are fighting it are women. In New York City, we've had a 53% decline in the number of people incarcerated in New York City, and now we're at the point where we can have an actual upfront discussion about closing Rikers Island. Again, that's not because some great technical assistance provider from the Council of State Governments came to New York City and said, oh, Mayor Giuliani, let's discuss how we would have a 53% decline in incarceration starting today until 2017. That's because people fought. And that's at every level, at grassroots level. There were programs in New York City, and I think they infected the discussion in a way it didn't get infected in the rest of the country, because in the rest of the country, incarceration went up by 12% during that same time that it was going down by half in New York.
You know, it's interesting, before we go to the questions and comments, throughout this whole conversation, which something makes me very proud of, and it started with Ayula, you use the term, Ayula, people who cause harm. Not once in this conversation have we ever used the word murderer, offender. And I think it came so easy, it was fluent. We didn't even realize that you weren't trying, like, let me not use that word. I think that's an important, we got to think about language is important. We know that, because I always give much respect to Eddie Ellis, but language is super important. And when we're able to amplify, because these folks already have humanity, but when we're able to amplify the humanity of these folks, it makes it easier to care and to pursue more humane ways of responding to some of these issues.
And we have to make moral arguments, by the way.
Yep.
Absolutely.
We can't make cost benefit, it costs less arguments. We have to make moral arguments about human dignity, period.
Like slavery was very cost effective.
It was. It was
For
very,
the people who owned plantations.
To this day, people still benefit.
It is an extremely cost effective way of organizing a society for the people who are property owners. Like that is, it doesn't get us out.
Audience, folks who come to the mic, say your name, question, please, no long statements. I'm begging of you, or I might just come around and pull the mic. So, just ask your question.
My name is Gio Geller. I'm a documentary filmmaker doing a documentary called The State of Empathy. And it's an indictment on the lack of empathy. And I wanted to echo what you were saying about local. I think that we really need to have the power of one person is more than the power of none, or the power of many often. And that I helped develop the New York City Board of Ed website, and when Rudy Crew asked me why I was doing that, I said, revenge. You should think about getting revenge against the system to try and make a difference. I came back and tried to make a difference. And what I'm asking you is, how can we as individuals make a difference to change the society, rather than look at the others to help us?
Thank you. Come to you. Now, I'm gonna take this young lady right behind him. Then I'm come.
My name is Janetta Johnson, and I work with transgender women that are in and out of prison. And I wanted to ask, how do we transcend the act of violence that is called erasure? Um, it's been very difficult for me as an African American transgender person to be in a space where majority of cis black men will not make eye contact with me, and in some ways that sort of kind of dehumanizes me. How do we humanize populations of people that have been dehumanized, especially from people that kind of look like them? And it's very difficult for me to hear people say Black Lives Matter and all of us are none when if there's any transgender African American transgender people in the room, please stand up. So where are my black transgender brothers and sisters? Where are my black transgender brothers and sisters that need to be included in this space? And also, I think black cis folks are to be held a lot more accountable because your silence is violence around the murders that are happening to black trans women. And it's hard when I go into a room and people literally run from me because of who I am, and that really dehumanizes me.
Thank you for those points. So we'll come to this. So the first two questions are: how can we, as individuals, affect this change? And secondly, how can we do with the issue of erasure, particularly of other groups that are sort of many times left out of the conversation? So particularly trans folks. Like, how do we make sure that those folks are always included in these conversations?
I'd like to address the first question. How can we as individuals make a difference or get involved? I often say that if we think of the totality of things that have to be done, it could be so overwhelming that we don't do anything. But everybody can't do everything, but everyone can do something. And so we need to find that one thing that we're passionate about, that we're gifted in, that we're talented in, and get involved with that. It's not complicated. Just that one thing that you're passionate about, you're committed to, and get involved with that.
I think it was Janetta who brought up the point about Black trans lives. I think you're right. I mean, I think we have to do better. I think we have to reach out and be more intentional about how we do outreach. I know I was just in Chicago on Thursday night giving a talk about Black women who are criminalized for self-defense and survival. And a big part of that talk was about Black trans women. And I actually had my friend Isha Love, who is a Black trans woman who was criminalized for self-defense, be part of the conversation on that particular talk, right? So you have to intentionally reach out to people, invite them in, and have that conversation. Chicago had a huge Black trans rally just on yesterday to support trans lives, the uplift and call out the names of the people who've been murdered and killed, call out, against the rescinding of the guidance for the trans bathroom bills, right? And I think they said 3,000 people showed up for that. At the event that I had on Thursday night, where I was speaking about criminalized survivors of violence, I called out that particular march and asked people to show up, right? So it's part of, as a cis Black woman, it's my responsibility to call out for my other sisters, and also to advocate and to fight on their behalf for their lives. I try to do that as an individual. I try to call on others to do that too, but we can always do more and we should do more. So I'm really sorry that you've had that experience of being isolated in this space. I think we all can afford to do much better than we have. So thank you for saying that.
Two more questions.
Hi, how you doing? My name is David Mims. I'm here representing Street Corner Resources, an anti-gun violence program that deals with the New York City Care Violence Contract that deals with the violence along in the city. My question is that what can we do to be more proactive? Because there's a lot of issues that's going on in reference to mental health. Now, we cannot be, the people of the community and our society cannot be productive in the community or, do things in the community if they are not mentally stable enough. So what measures can we do to be more proactive so that we could be more functional in the community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Kayla. I work at Brooklyn Defender Services. I would be remiss if we go through this weekend without bringing the child welfare system into the dialogue. And I think when we're talking about connecting the dots and the movements, I think like Glenn Martin asked, what are we doing wrong in the movement? And I think we absolutely need to include child welfare in this dialogue. Women have been persecuted in the family court system much longer than they've been persecuted in criminal court. Danielle, earlier you mentioned, those 4 factors: shame, isolation, exposure to violence, inability to meet one's economic needs. And that's absolutely applies to the child welfare system as well. So I guess my question to you is, for each of you and all of us to think about this weekend is like, what is that connection between child welfare and the persecution of poor mothers, mostly women of color, and what the connection is to the populations that we work with or the communities that we come from, and the overlap between child welfare and the criminal justice system and incarceration. And, we talk a lot about the school to prison pipeline, but we also should talk about the school to foster care pipeline.
So just to reiterate the 2 questions, how can we be more proactive when it comes to these conversations, particularly around mental health issues? Yes. And then the second question was, connection between child welfare, women of color, school to prison pipeline, school to welfare system pipeline, and all that.
Yeah. So I just have a couple of thoughts. I mean, one is I think that as an advocate, I didn't really know how important the advocacy for the departments were. Most of my focus was on the governor, on the mayor, on the legislature, but department heads wield an enormous amount of power, and often unchecked in many ways, and are I found very thin-skinned and susceptible to advocacy in ways that I don't. And I also feel this way about judges too. Judges, child welfare directors, mental health directors, probation directors. I could have fallen asleep in my job for 4 years as probation commissioner of New York City, and nobody would have known the difference.
It has probably happened.
What?
It has probably happened before.
Yeah. No, the current she's very good, the current administrator. But I think that the interplay between child welfare and mental health in both the juvenile systems and the adult systems is profound, and we often, I felt, let the child welfare and mental health systems kick people into the criminal justice system as the really lousy provider of services of last resort, and really humiliate both the people who get locked up, but also, as you mentioned, I don't know where you went, the families. I actually thought, because we opened up 14 offices in the neighborhoods that most of our people came from, and tried to make them more community based. So like a bunch of them, we moved into like the YMCA. That was what you went to CRPO, you were going to YMCA. Or in West Harlem, you went to CRPO, you were going to the probation. You were going to Fortune Society. That's where our office was. And then of course we would go to people's houses too. And I thought people were going to be like, no, don't come into our community. And there was definitely some of that, but they really hated child welfare. I mean, they were like they looked at them as like baby snatchers, and in a way that was really inadequate. I shouldn't say no, because that's too much an exaggeration, but an inadequate dialogue. And I think that the commissioner after commissioner after commissioner, we really get away with not having to deal with the communities, man. We could just park ourselves in our offices and never have to do it. And that's unacceptable. We need to add that to the advocacy. I know you guys got a long list already, but the advocacy list has to include pushing up against us folks. I had the ability as probation commissioner to recommend people get incarcerated, and we cut it in half. We were down to 3% is how many people we recommended get revoked, and it was 11% at one point. And the difference between 3 and 11% is that's a lot of human beings getting incarcerated. But nobody knew that. That was all inside baseball, and that shouldn't be inside baseball. The estimates are that half to a third of people who get locked up in America get locked up because of a violation of probation or parole. And ask yourself, when's the last time you marched on the probation commissioner or marched on the parole commissioner and said, you're locking too many people up? we don't yell at DAs enough. We also don't yell at commissioners of community corrections enough.
Can I also say that I think everything you're thinking about that you think needs to be done, somebody's doing right now. And I want to say that because, my friend Charity Tolliver runs this great organization in Chicago called Black on Both Sides, which addresses the foster care to prison pipeline and is using the leadership of young people who are in the system to advocate for themselves. So I bet you if you look in every city, there's somebody doing something that you already have thought about needs to be doing that needs more help, that you just need to identify and go and support. There's a great woman I met. I gave a talk at John Jay a couple of weeks ago, and she's here in New York, and she's pulling together all these foster moms to argue around criminalization and their children. And she's got this whole, she was making a pitch to people to come and join their network. I forgot the name of it, but if I find it, I'll pass it to Kathy or Cameron and they'll post it. But that's really important. The other thing I want to point out about your proactive mental health issue is, yes, we got to be proactive, but people are being proactive. There are places where people are doing mental health first aid in community, teaching community members how to respond to mental health issues rather than not calling the cops. There are programs like the Cahoots program in Portland where they're doing that. No more calling 911 when somebody's having a mental health episode. Get the community to come out. People in Oakland doing the same thing. There's a great project in Chicago called U Medics. What are they doing? My friend Martine started it. They're responding to gunshots in the community themselves before the ambulance gets there. They're helping people who are having asthma attacks in the community. They're doing mental health 101 trainings. That's just community. That's not tied to anything. I don't even think they have a 501c3. They're just doing the work. So I think everywhere you can imagine, there's so much frustration all the time. I come into these rooms and people are like, nobody. And it's like, no, you just don't know who's doing it. Yeah. That's the problem. Yeah. People are working. Yeah. They need more help and resources and funding. But everything you imagine, somebody's imagined before you. Probably better. No, just kidding. Just kidding. But, people are doing work all the time.
Really
and
quick,
I think
Danielle?
we can't forget that. Yeah.
And one thing I would add to that, too, is that when we talk about mental health, I think we think first and foremost about mental illness, and we don't think enough about trauma and pain. And that most people think is rooted in trauma and pain. So Common Justice runs something called Healing Works, which is a national learning collaborative of people working with young men of color harmed by crime. We're hosting a conference on April 12th called Revolutionary Healing, Paving the Way to Healing and Recovery for Young Men of Color Who Survive Violence and Trauma. And it's rooted in exactly what Mariam is talking about. We are not going to be training everyone at that conference. What we are going to be doing is lifting up the voices and expertise of people who know something about helping people come through. Because the reality is there is no way on earth communities of color would still be here to this day if y'all didn't know how to care for each other in some way.
Hello.
Right? With the amount of violence my people have done, there is no way on earth. And so the question is how do we, but those strategies are not identified as victim services. They aren't resourced. They aren't connected to one another. They aren't named. But they are not promoted. They are not funded. They are not invested in ways similarly to the whiteness as the ATI. As a white woman, if I call 311 and say I am a survivor of sexual violence, which I have been, they will connect me to a program run by somebody who looks like me, where the person I'm going to work with is going to be somebody who looks like me and shares my experience, that is going to be free to me and in walking distance of my house. I'm not saying I don't deserve that. I will say, to be real, when I survived sexual violence in my teens, the existence of those programs saved my life. I never actually went to any of them, so it seems weird to say that something I never went to saved my life. And what I mean by that is the fact that they existed, it communicated to me what happened to me was wrong, that I would need to heal, that I deserved to heal, and that I could heal, which is like the trifecta of healing, right? And it's the thing that opens me up to reaching out through informal channels to the people I love to say, shit, this thing happened to me, and to expect care in response to that, which I got, because we do, as people, we love each other pretty well when we get the chance, right? When things get out of our way. And so similarly, the same way we know how to divert people, and the evidence of that is in our treatment of white people, we know how to resource the kind of caretaking that happens informally, and for white community is the sort of thing that allows us to get a paycheck to do. And so some of it, too, is about how do we honor the healing work that happens informally? How do we lift it up? How do we connect people, learn from each other? Because not everybody needs to be paid. Not everyone needs to be a 501c3. But also, how can we transform the distribution of resources so the majority of resources for healing go to the places where the majority of violence occur?
So we have 4 more questions. please make sure that they're very pointed and to a particular person. So I'm gonna start with you, young lady. I'm gonna go to the back, and I'm gonna go to the other two. So, and please, panelists, please answer them one person. All right?
Hello. My name is Akira Johnson, and if it's okay, can I ask 3 questions?
It's not okay. It's okay, but not okay for right now.
Okay, yeah. But my one of the questions are how does the programs empower the youth? And the second question, that'll be it. How does the police in the communities like you said that we have programs and we have things to help the young children that are in the communities, but what happens when you're too afraid to even call people within your communities or even the police as well? So what do you do from there?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. In the back.
My name is Alexis. I work at the Prisoner Reentry Institute. And I don't have a question, but I did want to take this opportunity to offer a call to action that there will be a rally Monday, March 6th from 6:30 to 8 at Barclay Center to uplift and stand in solidarity with our trans brothers and sisters in response to the murders that have been happening. So if you want to address that question that was brought by a trans sister, then you have the opportunity now to do so.
What time?
From 6:30 to 8 p.m. at Barclay Center Monday.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. So I have a question. I guess it's like a historical question. Would it be accurate to say that the big bifurcation of nonviolent offenders and violent was due to when more white people started using opiate substances and
She's trying to start something. All right, okay. All right, trying to start something. All right.
Good afternoon. My name is Eva. I'm Eva Supreme Queen. I'm the founder of I'm My Sister's Keeper, Worthy by Choice. And I've been working with women in the community since 2010, under the radar. Under the radar. I've been working with women that have sons that's incarcerated. A lot of these women are getting services out, they're getting services. They're getting mental health services, substance abuse services, but they're not getting services on how to interact back with their children. They don't know how to, when that son is coming home from jail, they don't know how to relate to them in a way of changing, of saying, you can no longer bring the guns in my house. And it's not all right for you to bring a package of heroin in my house anymore, although I'm the first one that gave it to you. Because I've changed. And these are the mothers that I'm working with no funding. With no funding. Helping them with their self-esteem, allowing them to feel good about themselves by doing community service. So my question to you guys is like, where is the services in regards to that? What's happening with these children that's coming home to that mother? They're getting released from jail. They're coming home to that mother that has no service in place in how to interact with her family appropriately.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we got a couple questions on the table. The first one is a two-part. How do these programs empower young folks, the youth? And also, what happens when you're too scared to call police or anyone else about when some of these things may happen to you in the communities, when you're harmed? And two more, the question regarding this sort of bifurcation between nonviolent versus violent. Did it happen when white folks started being the ones who using the drivers of heroin usage and other opiate usage? And what happens, and what are services for young folks when they come home from these facilities to integrate into their families in a way that's productive?
I'll just take the youth stuff quickly, since that's what our work has been to support the development of youth leaders to basically fight for their own lives on a regular basis. So one of the ways that we've done that was through starting a project called Circles and Ciphers, which is a hip hop leadership development program that is run by young people in conflict with the law and gang affiliated young people. So they organize around restorative justice, teach restorative justice to each other and to their community. And they do their own recruiting and their own support and all that kind of stuff. We incubated them and catalyzed them, and now they're on their own. They run their own stuff. So that's really important, right? I don't just talk about youth leadership. I develop young leaders and then give them the reins to do their own work. I think that's really important. And the answer to your question about how, you might be afraid to come, a lot of those young people were from rival gangs, and they came together because they trusted each other and trusted their own ability to make peace with themselves. And so that's really, really important. But, a lot of them do have issues with the cops in the community. We tried many different kinds of ways to address that. And finally, we just created our own kind of zone of safety where cops are not allowed within a block radius of the space where they meet. And that's mainly just run by those young people themselves. They wait outside, they walk people to the space, they do a whole bunch of stuff around safety. So hope that answers your question. Okay.
So I wanted to briefly answer your question also. Everything isn't always about programs. Oftentimes it's just about community. And so one of the things that I've done is I recognize that young men of color don't often even see themselves as victims. Though they've been shot, they've been stabbed, they've been, all these things they've been harmed, but which is why I don't use the word victim also, because of the connotation with it. So one of the things that we did last year was we had a dinner honoring survivors, young men of color. And we brought together about 30 young men who had somehow been harmed in the community and let them be in community with each other and kind of break the feeling of isolation and all the things that comes with being harmed. Or in my son's case, he was harmed and he also watched his friend die. And then 15 months later, lost his younger brother. And that's, unfortunately, our story isn't an isolated story. So sometimes it's building community and allowing that community to be with themselves and heal in the way that they know how. And the other part to kind of address what you're saying, my sister, is I work with the young men in getting them ready to come home and getting them ready to honor their mom's houses, irregardless to what mom is doing now or what she used to do. We need you to be different. And so that doesn't directly answer what you were saying, but the work has to be done. There's a need for the work to be done on both sides, and every single day I'm working with those young men, preparing them to come home to our families, to our communities in a different way in which they left.
I can say something about the violent, nonviolent divide. So I think the reason we were like, no, it's not from that is because it's older than that, not that it's not present in the example you give. Where's the person who asked that? Hi. I think it's very present exactly in the example you give, though I think the example you give is much more about the fact that when the criminal justice system, it has expanded so much that it is inadvertently catching white people.
That's right.
Yep. Right? And so when it does that, we're like, whoa, like something has gone out of control and we have to kind of reshape. It's like some redistricting. Like if you look at district maps that are like, right? Like we have to draw it crazy for every single person brought into Vinny's custody to be a person of color. Those boundaries have to be drawn in a completely irrational way to produce the disparities we see. And so, but the division of talking about violent versus nonviolent people. First of all, like where I grew up, we weren't like, oh yeah, that's the guy with the drugs and that's the guy with the gun, right? Like it was the same guy, right? And like your uncle who's most likely to drink at the barbecue and your uncle who's most likely to throw a punch is the same uncle, right? Like it's not, and each of us, like we commit different kinds of harm. We're whole people. Like the one thing that almost everybody who commits violence has in common is that we are all survivors of violence. Like I will challenge anyone to find someone who's committed serious violence who hasn't survived violence at least that serious. So the people who commit violence are a subset of the larger category of crime survivors, which means almost everybody who is incarcerated for violence is a subset of the larger category of crime survivors. The move to isolate nonviolent cases is largely a political strategy, right? Yes, it's the people are like, we can win, we can't win the whole thing, we can win this, and we're going to free hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people by doing that. When those decisions are made in accountable relationships with the people whose lives are at stake, I'm about it, right? Like ain't no policy perfect. Like we're not getting anywhere through purity. We're only getting somewhere through righteousness, right? So I'm not opposed to policy reform that targets nonviolent offenses. I get it. Like we win what we can win so people are free as long as the compromises we're making are made in accountable relationship. The problem is when we win it by throwing other people on the bus. So instead of saying these people should be free, we say these people ain't like those people. Right? That's different. That's a narrative strategy. That's a communication strategy. That's not substantive. Right? That doesn't change the law, which on the face of it is an improvement because it frees people who've committed nonviolent crimes and should pass. And so that narrative strategy is not just as old as mass incarceration. It's as old as this country, right? Like we tell a story that white women are in danger and black men are dangerous. We don't talk about women of color at all. And we try not to talk about white men because they're just assumed as like the default, right? And so, and what we tell is we tell this story of this like imagined monstrous other who is not quite human and from whom we all have to be protected. And we conjure that fear and we do it over and over and over again in our storytelling. That myth is the core myth of structural racism, and it is the core myth of mass incarceration, and it is the core myth of this divide that we talk about. So every time we invoke that myth, even if it is to free people for nonviolent crimes, it's like we are, trying to chop down the branches, and meanwhile we're spilling fertilizer from our tool belt and nurturing the roots. Right. And it's like, and so we have to be aware of when those strategies are counterproductive, when the way we win interim victories fundamentally supports the philosophy and narrative and set of beliefs that nurture this thing in the first place.
Ladies and gentlemen, I thought I could do good on time, but either I just want to conclude with this one sort of thing, and it's something I always tell folks is that when you watch the news, and particularly when it comes to political strategy and rhetoric, when you see the news report about that person committed that crime, she or he did whatever it was, I'm asking you to question how you respond. Mm-hmm. That is all I'm going to leave with. I want to give a round of applause to Marian Kaba, Vincent Shiralu, Danielle Sered, and Yula Mitchell.
Quick announcement, guys. We're not done. First, thank you guys again for this panel. Panel was sickening. But we're going to continue.